Hey, here's another reading space for the Color of Law series. This is chapter 4, Own Your Own Home. I'm gonna take a pause and wait for more people to come in. But so yeah, it'll be an audiobook. Basically, we read through it. There will be some breaks where we'll have like additional commentary, but we'll try to keep it to the as much to the book as possible. So I'm gonna just wait until, to see if Jet and Nitra show up. My baby mom's is here, so just wait a minute. I threw you. Oh, okay, you got it.
I'm just
Yo, am
inviting
I
people.
low?
No, I'm just inviting people.
Oh, okay. So I'll wait a couple minutes and then I'll go ahead and start it since it's recorded. So since it's 7, I'm gonna go ahead and start it. It's recorded, so anybody can come back and listen to it that missed a portion of it. So starting off chapter 4, color of law, own your own home. Exclusionary zoning ordinances could be and have been successful in keeping low-income African Americans, indeed all low-income families, out of middle-class neighborhoods. But for those wanting to segregate America, zoning solved only half the problem. Zoning that created neighborhoods of only single-family homes cannot keep out middle-class African Americans. Hubert Hoover's seemingly race-neutral zoning recommendations could not prevent African Americans who could afford to live in expensive communities from doing so. Frequently, the African Americans who attempted to pioneer the integration of white middle class neighborhoods were of higher social status than their white neighbors, and they were rarely of lower status. The incident that provoked Baltimore to adopt this racial zoning ordinance in 1910 was a prominent African American lawyer moving onto a major white block. Economic zoning without racial exclusion cannot have prevented Frank Stevenson or his African American coworkers from moving into, well, I don't know how to say that word, so I say Town M subdivisions where many of their white Ford Union brothers were settling. To ban Frank Stevenson and his friends, different tools were needed. The federal government developed them in full contempt of its constitutional obligation. First, the government embarked on a scheme to persuade as many white families as possible to move from urban apartments to single-family urban suburban homes. Then, once suburbanization was underway, the government, with explicit racial intent, made it nearly impossible for African Americans to follow. You ready to take the next session, choose?
Oh snap! I didn't realize it was that soon. Wait, hold on.
No, it's all good. I can read another section.
Can you just read one more? Because I'm still inviting people, and I
I
just
got
put
you.
the PDF in the jumbo.
Appreciate you. The federal government's policy of racial exclusion had roots earlier in the 20th century. The Wilson's administration took the initial steps. Terrified by 1917 Russian Revolution, government officials came to believe that communism could be defeated in the United States by getting as many white Americans as possible to become homeowners. The idea being that those who own property would be invested in a capitalist system. So in 1917, the federal government of labor promoted an Own Your Own Home campaign, handing out We Own Our Own Home buttons to school children and distributing pamphlets saying that it was a patriotic duty to cease renting and to build a single family unit. The department printed more than 2 million posters to be hung in factories and other businesses and published newspaper advertisements throughout the country promoting single family ownership. Each one had an image of a white couple or a family. Here too, Secretary of Commerce Hoover, Hoover played an important role. Upon assuming office in 1921, he not only developed a campaign to encourage exclusionary zoning, but to complement that effort, he also headed up a new Better Homes in America organization. Although it was nominally private, Hoover served as president. The executive director was James Ford, who had overseen Frederick Law Olmsted Jr. When he designed the whites-only public housing program during World War I, the chairman of its advisory council was Vice President Calvin Coolidge, and a member was the president of the American Construction Council, Franklin D. Roosevelt. Hoover boasted that the organization was practically directed by the department, which published a pamphlet, How to Own Your Own Home, and conducted other promotional activities. It sponsored forums in communities across the nation on the benefits of property ownership, including how to avoid racial strife. Just strife, Better Homes representatives probably told audiences could be avoided by moving to single family houses away from African Americans in urban areas. In 1923, another department publication promoted ethnic and racial homogeny by urging potential homebuyers to consider the general type of people living in a neighborhood before making a purchase. Later, as president, Hoover asserted that it was self-evident that every thrifty family has an inherent right to own a home. He convened the President's Conference on Home Building and Home Ownership, hoping in the depths of the Depression to revive housing construction and sales. In this opening address, he told the conference that single-family homes were expressions of racial longing and that our people should live in their own homes is a sentiment deep in the heart of our race. On the eve of the conference, Better Homes in America published a Better Homes Manual, a compendium, I do not know how to say that word, of housing recommendations from the organization's leader. James Ford explained that apartments were the worst kind of housing, frequently overcrowded because of the ignorant racial habit of African Americans and European immigrants. John Breeze, director of the President's Conference, and James S. Taylor, chief of the Department of Commerce Housing Division, listed 30 items a prospective purchaser would consider. In the midst of the advice, such as use of a dependable real estate expert and make sure there is good transportation to work, was item number 19. Buy partnership in the community. Restricted residential districts may serve as protection against persons with whom your family won't care to associate, provided the restrictions are reinforced and are not merely temporary. There was little doubt about who the person to be avoided might be. The conference documents themselves, written and endorsed by some of the nation's most prominent racial segregationists, clarified what restricted residential districts should accomplish. One member of the conference planning committee was Frederick Ecker, president of the Metropolitan Life Insurance Company, who chaired a committee on financial ownership. His report, adopted and published by the federal government, recommended that zoning laws be supplemented by deed restrictions to prevent incompatible ownership occupancy, a phrase generally understood to mean prevention of property sales to African Americans. Under Ecker's leadership, a few years after the conference concluded, Metropolitan Life developed the largest planned community in the nation, Parkchester in New York City, from which African Americans were barred. When one apartment was sublet to a black family, Ecker had them evicted. The Hoover Conference's Committee on Planning New Subdivisions included Robert Whitten, who had designed Atlanta's racial zoning scheme in 1922 that flouted the Supreme Court's Buchanan's decision. Another was Lawrence Stevenson, president-elect of National Association of Real Estate Boards, which had recently adopted its ethics rule prohibiting agents from selling homes to African Americans in white neighborhoods. The committee was headed by Harlan Bartholomew, who 10 years earlier had led the St. Louis Plan Commission in using zoning to evade Buchanan while enforcing segregation. One of the conference's 31 committees was devoted to Negro housing. Its report was written by the prominent social scientist Charles S. Johnson, with help from other African American experts. It documented violence against African Americans who attempted to live in previously white neighborhoods but issued no call for measures to prevent this. With just a hint of disapproval, it described court permissions for zoning and other legal devices to impose segregation. It concluded by recommending the removal of legislation restrictive of Negro residents, and that Negro follow the trend in urban communities and move out into subdivisions in which modern homes can be built. The report did not address the inconsistencies of such proposals with the conference's endorsements of residential segregation, Most of Johnson's report was devoted to recommending improvements in the quality of urban apartments where African Americans were forced to live in northern cities. The Johnson report on Negro housing garnered little attention, and the federal government's insistence that African Americans be excluded from single family suburbs became more explicit during the New Deal. As with the public housing programs of the PWA, federal promotion of homeownership became inseparable from a policy of racial segregation.
Although the federal government had been trying to persuade middle class families to buy single family homes for more than 14 years, the campaign had achieved little by the time Franklin D. Roosevelt took office in 1933. Homeownership remained prohibitively expensive for the working and middle class families. Bank mortgages typically required 50% down, interest only payments, and repayment in full after 5 to 7 years, at which point the borrower would have to refinance or find another bank to issue a new mortgage with similar terms. Few urban working and middle class families had the financial capacity to do what was being asked. The Depression made the housing crisis even worse. Many property owning families with mortgages couldn't make their payments and were subject to foreclosure. With most others unable to afford homes at all, the construction industry was stalled. The New Deal designed one program to support existing homeowners who couldn't make payments, and another to make first time home ownership possible for the middle class. In 1933, to rescue households that were about to default, the administration created the Homeowners Loan Corporation, HOLC. It purchased existing mortgages that were subject to imminent foreclosure and then issued new mortgages with repayment schedules of up to 15 years, later extended to 25 years. In addition, HLOC mortgage were amortized, meaning that each month's payments included some principal as well as interest. So when the loan was paid off, the borrower would own the home. Thus, for the first time, working and middle class homeowners could gradually gain equity while their properties were still mortgaged. If a family with an amortized mortgage sold his home, the equity, including any appreciation, would be the family's to keep. HOLC mortgages had low interest rates, but the borrowers still were obligated to make regular payments, and the HOLC therefore had to exercise prudence about its borrowers' ability to avoid default. To assess risks, the HOLC wanted to know something about the condition of the house and of the surrounding houses in the neighborhood to see whether the property would likely maintain its value. The HLOC hired the local real estate agents to make appraisals on which refinancing decisions could be based. With these agents required by their national ethics codes to maintain segregation, it is not surprising that engaging risk, HLOC considered the racial composition of neighborhoods. The HLOC created color coded maps of every metropolitan area in the nation, with the safest neighborhoods colored green and the riskiest colored red. A neighborhood earns a red color if African Americans lived in it, even if it was a solid middle class neighborhood of single family homes. For example, in St. Louis, the white middle class suburb of Ladue was colored green because, according to the HLC appraiser in 1940, it had not a single foreigner or Negro. That similarly middle class suburban area of Lincoln Terrace was colored red because it had little or no value today due to the colored element now controlling the district. Although the HLOC did not always decline to rescue homeowners in neighborhoods colored red on its map, i.e., red line neighborhoods, the maps had a huge impact and put the federal government on record as judging that African Americans, simply because of their race, were poor risks. To solve the inability of middle class renters to purchase single family homes for the first time, Congress and President Roosevelt created the Federal Housing Administration in 1934. The FHA insured bank mortgages that covered 80% of purchase prices, had terms of 20 years, and were fully amortized. To be eligible for such insurance, the FHA insisted on doing its own appraisal of the property to make certain that the loan had a low risk of default. Because of the FHA's appraisal standards included a whites only requirement, racial segregation now became an official requirement of the federal mortgage insurance system. That's crazy. The FHA judged that properties would be too risky for insurance if they were in racially mixed neighborhoods or even in white neighborhoods near black ones that might possibly integrate in the future. When a bank applied to the FHA insurance on a prospective loan, the agency conducted a property appraisal, which was also likely performed by a local real estate agent hired by the agency. As the volume of applications increased, the agency hired its own appraisers, usually from the ranks of the private real estate agents who had previously been working as contractors for the FHA. To guide their work, the FHA provided them with an underwriting manual. The first, issued in 1935, gave this instruction, quote, if a neighborhood is to retain stability, it is necessary that property shall be continued to be by the same social and racial classes. A change in social or racial occupancy generally leads to instability and a reduction in values, end quote. Appraisers were told to give higher ratings where, quote, protection amongst against some adverse influences is obtained, end quote. And important among adverse influences are an infiltration of inharmonious racial or nationality groups. Jesus Christ. That wasn't in the book, that was me. The manual concluded that all, quote, all mortgages on properties protected against such unfavorable influence to the extent such protection is possible will obtain a high rating. The FHA discouraged banks from making any loans at all in urban neighborhoods rather than newly built suburbs, according to the underwriting manual. Older properties have a tendency to accelerate the rate of transition to lower class occupancy. So basically, older properties are likely to deteriorate faster, and so lower class people will more likely occupy them. The FHA favored mortgages in areas where boulevards or highways serve to separate African American families from whites, stating that natural or artificially established barriers will prove effective in protecting a neighborhood and the locations within it from adverse influences, including prevention of infiltration of lower class occupancy and inharmonious racial groups. This word inharmonious is killing me because we know what they mean by that. Because they're talking about niggas. Because there's some racial groups that are harmonious, I guess, but we're the unruly ones. Which that's why I love that word, unruly. Anyway, sorry. Subsequent editions of underwriting manual through the 1940s repeated these guidelines. In 1947, the FHA removed words like inharmonious, look at that, inharmonious racial groups from the manual, but barely pretended that this represented a policy change. The manual still specified lower valuation when compatibility among the neighborhood occupants was lacking. And to make sure there was no misunderstanding, the FHA's head told Congress that the agency had no right to require non discrimination in its mortgage insurance program. That in the 1952 underwriting manual continued to base property valuations in part on whether properties were located in neighborhoods where there was compatibility among the neighborhood occupants. FHA policy in this regard was consistent. In 1941, a New Jersey real estate agent representing a new development in the suburban Fanwood, about 20 miles west of Newark, attempted to sell 12 properties to middle class African Americans. All had good credit ratings, and the banks were willing to issue mortgages if the FHA would approve. But the agency stated that no loans will be given to colored developments. When banks told the real estate agent that without FHA endorsement they would not issue the mortgages, he approached the Prudential Life Insurance Company, which also has said that although the applicants were all creditworthy, it could not issue mortgages unless the FHA approved. Today, Faneuil's population remains 5% black in a county with a black population of about 25%. In 1958, a white San Francisco school teacher, Gerald Cohn, Cohn, anyway, purchased a house with a FHA guaranteed mortgage in the Elmwood district of Berkeley. By the closing date, Mr. Khan, sorry, I'll be funny, it's not Kuhn, it's Khan, wasn't ready to move in. While keeping up with his mortgage payments, rented the house to a fellow school teacher, Alfred Simmons, an African American. The Berkeley chief of police asked the Federal Bureau of Investigation, the FBI, to inquire how Mr. Simmons has managed to get into this all-white community. The Bureau questioned Gerald Kahn, I like Kahn now, neighbors in the San Francisco, but failed to find evidence that he had obtained his mortgage under false pretenses. In other words, that he had never intended to occupy his Berkeley home, but had always planned to rent it to an African American. The FBI referred the case to the U.S. attorney, who refused to prosecute because no law had been broken. The FHA, however, then blacklisted Mr. Khan, advising him that he would be denied the benefits of participation in the FHA insurance program and never again be able to obtain a government backed mortgage. The director of the San Francisco FHA office wrote to him, quote, "This is to advise you that any application for mortgage insurance under the programs of this administration submitted by you or any firm in which you have at least 10% interest will be rejected on the basis of unsatisfactory risk determination made by this office on April 30th, 1959. In thousands of communities between Fanwood and Berkeley, FHA policy was the same, with very few exceptions. No guarantees for mortgages to African Americans or to whites, who might lease to African Americans, regardless of the applicant's credit worthiness.
Yo, the crackers are fucking wild. So
Yo, they said, yo, okay, sorry, this is for the recording, but child.
that's why when people have arguments and say like, "Oh, capitalism is about the free market," no, the fuck it's not. Like, here you go, right here, a perfect example. But yeah, mm-mm-mm. So the next session. A few years ago, I received a note from Pam Harris, a school teacher in Georgia, who had heard a radio program where I discussed the history of neighborhood racial segregation. As it happened, Miss Harris' family traced its roots to Hamburg, South Carolina, the town where white terror persuaded many African Americans to seek safety and security in the North. Her family's story, like that of Frank Stevenson, exposes how de jure segregation operated to establish the racial divisions we know today. Miss Harris told me about a great uncle, Leroy Merriday, who was born in Hamburg 14 years after the Red Shirt scare. His father worked in the brickyards, and Leroy himself became a blacksmith, shoeing horses for the cavalry in France in World War I. There he caught the attention of a railroad tycoon, August Belmont II, who was serving in the U.S. Army Supply Department. A passionate horse racer, he had built the Belmont racetrack on Long Island, New York. Impressed with Leroy Merriday's skill, Belmont asked him to work at his track. Mr. Merriday went on to have a successful career there, shoeing Man o' War, among other great thoroughbreds. Oh, hold on. Let me go ahead and bring you back up. Okay. Let's see. He found lodging in Hempstead, not far from the racetrack, and soon sent for a younger brother, Charles, who in turn persuaded brothers Arthur and Robert, sister Lely, and their parents to come north. Charles recruited several classmates to join them. The extended Merriday family and other Hamburg refugees all initially lived in a single street in Hempstead, an early African American settlement on Long Island. Robert Merriday, the youngest of the brothers, played the saxophone and in the 1930s was part of a well-known jazz ensemble. During World War II, the federal government sponsored the United Service Organizations to support the troops and workers in defense plants, and he joined a USO band that entertained workers at the Grumman aircraft plant in Bethpage, Long Island. The contacts Robert Merriday made there led to the company hiring him as one of its first African American employees. Grumman, like the Ford Motor Company in Richmond, California, had exhausted the supply of white workers available to meet its military contracts and had begun to recruit African Americans for the first time. At Grumman, Robert Merriday was able to save money to start a trucking business when the war ended. He bought inexpensive Army surplus trucks and repurposed them himself from heavy hauling. In 1946, when William Levitt was building houses for returning veterans in Roslyn, Long Island, the Merriday Company got work hauling cement blocks that lined the development cesspools. Soon Levitt began to develop the massive Levittown subdivision nearby, and Robert Merriday won a contract to deliver drywall to the construction site. His business expanded to half a dozen trucks. When several nephews returned from military service, they joined the company. Robert Merriday had a solid middle-class income in the late 1940s and was able to pay his nephews decently. He had married and was raising a family, but Levitt and other subdivision developers would not sell homes to any of the Merridays or to other African Americans who were helping to build the nation's suburbs. African Americans did not lack the necessary qualifications. The Merriday's economic circumstances were similar to those of the white workers and returning veterans who became Levittowners. But, as Robert Merriday's son later recalled, his father had most other relatives, didn't bother to file applications, although Levittown homes were attractive and well designed. It was generally known that black people couldn't buy into the development. When you grow up and live in a place, you know what the rules are. Nonetheless, one nephew who worked for the trucking business tried. Like most of those who moved into Levittown, Vince Merriday was a veteran. He'd been in the Navy during World War II and stationed at the Great Lakes Naval Training Center outside Chicago. Just before the war, Secretary of the Navy Frank Knox had told President Roosevelt he would resign if the Navy were forced to take African Americans in roles other than their traditional ones in food service and as personal servants to officers. However, when it became widely known that the most heroic American sailor at Pearl Harbor was Private Dory Miller, an African American kitchen worker, he had run through flaming oil to carry his ship's captain to safety, then grabbed a machine gun and shot down Japanese aircraft. Public pressure forced Knox to accede. At Great Lakes, however, African American recruits were not permitted to train with whites, and the Navy established a segregated training camp for them. Vince Merriday passed tests to be a pilot, but because African Americans were barred from entering flight training, he was assigned to mechanic duty for for the war's duration. After the Japanese surrender in 1945, Vince Merriday went to work for his uncles delivering material in Levittown. When he attempted to buy a house in the development, his application was refused. Instead, he bought a house in an almost all-black neighborhood suburb, Lakeview. Although Levittowners could buy property with no down payments and low interest Veterans Administration mortgages, Vince Merriday had to make a substantial down payment in Lakeview and get an uninsured mortgage with higher market interest rates. His experience of discrimination in the Navy and in the housing market permanently embittered him. When William Levitt's refusal to sell a home to Vince Merriday was not a mere reflection of the builder's prejudicial views. Had he felt differently and chosen to integrate Levittown, the federal government would have refused to subsidize him. In the decades following World War II, suburbs across the country, as in M-Town and Palo Alto and Levittown, were created in this way, with the FHA administering an explicit racial policy that solidified segregation in every one of our metropolitan areas.
I just hear my dad's voice in my head when I was a little kid. He said the army ain't no place for a black person. When I told him I wanted to join the army, he was like, the army is no place for a black person. When I hear this history, I'm like, God damn. Child. After World War II, the newly established VA also began to guarantee mortgages for returning servicemen. It adopted FHA housing policies, and VA appraisers rely on FHA's underwriting manual. By 1950, the FHA and VA together were insuring half of all new mortgages nationwide. The FHA had its biggest impact on segregation, but not in its discriminatory evaluations of individual mortgage applicants, but in its financing of entire subdivisions, in many cases entire suburbs, as racially exclusive white enclaves. Frank Stevenson was not denied the opportunity to follow his job to Milpitas because FHA refused to insure an individual mortgage for him. Vince Merriday was not denied the opportunity to live in Levittown because the VA appraiser considered his individual purchase too risky for a mortgage guarantee. Rather, in these and thousands of other locales, mass production builders created entire suburbs with the FHA or VA imposed condition that these suburbs be all white. As Frank Stevenson and Robert Merriday understood, and as Vince Merriday learned, African Americans need not bother to apply. Levittown was a massive undertaking, a development of 17,500 homes. It was a visionary solution to the housing problems of returning war veterans. Mass produced two-bedroom houses of 750 square feet sold for about $8,000 each, with no down payment required. William Levitt constructed the project on speculation. It was not a case in which prospective purchasers gave the company funds with which to construct houses. Instead, Levitt built the houses and then sought customers. He could have never amassed the capital for such an enormous undertaking without the FHA and the VA. But during the World War II years and after, the government had congressional authority to guarantee bank loans to mass production builders like Levitt for nearly the full cost of their proposed subdivisions. By 1948, most housing nationwide was being constructed with this government financing. Once Levitt had plans and designed Levittown, his company submitted drawings and specifications to the FHA for approval. After the agency endorsed the plans, he could use this approval to negotiate low interest loans from banks to finance its construction and land acquisition costs. The banks were willing to give these concessionary loans to Levitt and to other mass production builders because FHA pre approval meant that the banks could subsequently issue mortgages to the actual buyers without further property appraisal needed. Instead of local FHA appraisers taking the underwriting manual and going out to inspect the individual properties for which mortgage insurance was sought, there was, after all, nothing but empty land to inspect. The FHA almost automatically insured mortgages for the eventual buyers of the houses based on its approval of the pre construction plans. The banks, therefore, were exposed to little risk from issuing these mortgages. For Levittown and scores of developments across the nation, the plans reviewed by the FHA included the approved construction materials, the design specifications, the proposed sale price, the neighborhood zoning restrictions, for example, a prohibition of industry or commercial development, and a commitment not to sell to African Americans. The FHA even withheld approval if the presence of African Americans in nearby neighborhoods threatened integration. In short, the FHA financed Levittown on the condition, like the Richmond suburb of Rolling Wood during the war, it be all white, with no foreseeable change in its racial composition. The FHA's involvement was so pervasive that full-time government inspectors were stationed at the construction sites where Levittown and similar projects were being built. As William Levitt testified before Congress in 1957, quote, "We are 100% dependent on the government," quote. Child, they be calling us welfare queens. Anyway, sorry. In 1960, a New Jersey court concluded that Levitt's project in the state was so dependent on the FHA that it was quote, publicly assisted housing, unquote, that it therefore could not refuse to sell to African Americans under New Jersey law. The court opinion included a detailed description of the numerous ways in which the FHA directed the project's design, construction, and financing, as well as Levitt's acknowledgement of his dependence on government involvement. The case had no national consequences because the order to sell to African Americans was based on New Jersey, not federal law. Although Levittown came to symbolize post-war suburbanization, Levittown was neither the first nor the only such development financed by the FHA and VA for white families. Metropolitan areas nationwide were suburbanized by this government policy. The first was Oak Forest, built in 1946 on Houston's northwest side. Shortly thereafter, Peary Village in Kansas City's Mushrooms, also financed with FHA guarantees. The extraordinary growth of California and the West in the decades following World War II was financed on a racially restricted basis by the federal government. Westlake, a 1950 development in Daly City, southwest of San Francisco; Lakewood, south of Los Angeles, constructed between 1949 and 1953 and only slightly smaller than Levittown; Westchester, also south of Los Angeles and developed by Kaiser Community Homes, an offshoot of the wartime shipbuilding company; and Panorama City in the South San Fernando Valley were all FHA whites-only projects. Ben, you want me to continue reading?
Ooh, my bad. I was talking and muted. My bad.
Oh, okay. You want me to go? Or you good?
Nah, I'm good. My
Okay.
fault. Appreciate you.
Appreciate you.
So It's almost to the end. We got like 2 pages. So a St. Louis story illustrates how stark the FHA policy could be. Charles Batterot was an area builder who obtained advanced FHA guarantees for a subdivision of single-family homes in western St. Louis County. Vatterott called his development St. Anne and intended it to be a community for lower middle class Catholics, particularly returning war veterans. He began construction in 1943, and while he made a special effort to recruit Catholics, he did not prohibit sales to non Catholic whites. He barred only blacks, as the FHA required. Vatterott had relatively moderate attitudes on racial matters and believed that the housing needs of African Americans should also be addressed, but in separate projects. So after completing St. Anne, he constructed a subdivision for African Americans, deprivation, in the town of Breckenridge Hills, a few miles away from St. Anne. He intended to sell to African Americans whose incomes and occupations, from truck drivers to chemists, were similar to those of St. Anne buyers. These were the kinds of potential purchasers who, if they were white, could have bought into St. Anne's or any of the many other subdivisions developed throughout St. Louis County in the post-war period. But because the poorest was intended for African Americans, Federal could not get FHA financing for it. As a result, the construction was shoddier and the house design skimpier than it had been in St. Anne. Because potential buyers were denied FHA or VH mortgages, many of the homes were rented. Vatterott set up a special savings plan by which families without FHA or VHA mortgages could put aside money toward a purchase of their homes. But unlike St. Anne residents, the DePorres savers could not accumulate equity during this process. The DePorres development for African Americans also lacked the community facilities, parks, and playgrounds that Vatterott had built into the St. Anne subdivision. And we got this last section. Did you
Niggas
want me to read it
called it.
right quick or you got it?
I got it, but these niggas really called it the pores. Like I want y'all to really. I think Pet. I think you're saying that right. They called our shit the pores. I'm shook right now. Okay, I'm sorry.
No,
Racism
you
is not
good.
funny, but sometimes it's a little bit outrageous. Anyway, when the FHA rejected proposals for projects like DePores that might house African Americans or otherwise threaten future integration, the agency didn't mask the racial basis of its decisions. In 1940, for example, a Detroit builder was denied FHA insurance for a project that was near an African American neighborhood. He then constructed a half-mile concrete wall 6 feet high and a foot thick, separating the two neighborhoods. And the FHA then approved the loan. Occasionally, FHA mortgage holders did default, and that agency repossessed the property and then resold it. To make certain that such a resale did not undermine the segregation policy, the FHA contracted with real estate brokers who refused to sell it to African Americans. On rare occasions, the FHA approved loans for segregated African American developments. In 1954, responding to a severe housing shortage for African Americans and hoping to dampen civil rights protests, New Orleans Mayor DeLesseps S. Morrison begged the FHA to ensure a development for middle-class Black professionals and promised the agency that no units would be sold to whites. The New Orleans NAACP chapter protested the creation of a segregated housing development. The agency ignored the protests, and the development eventually consisted of 1,000 homes for African Americans only, surrounding a park and a golf course, and an adjoining similar FHA-insured development for whites only. In 1955, an FHA spokesman toured 50 cities where he addressed African American audiences, boasting of New Orleans' achievements and telling his listeners that such segregated projects were, quote, the type of thing the FHA wanted, end quote. A pattern emerges from these examples. Government's commitment to separating residential areas by race began nationwide following the violent suppression of Reconstruction after 1877. Although the Supreme Court in 1917 forbade the first wave of policies, racial segregation by zoning ordinance, the federal government began to recommend ways that cities could evade that ruling, not only in the southern and border states, but across the country. In the 1920s, a Harding administration committee promoted zoning ordinances that distinguished single family from multifamily districts. Although government publications did not say it in as many words, committee members made little effort to hide that an important purpose was to prevent racial integration. Simultaneously, and throughout the 1920s and the Hoover administration, the government constructed a propaganda campaign directed at white middle class families to persuade them to move out of apartments and into single family dwellings. During the 1930s, the Roosevelt administration created maps of every metropolitan area, divided into zones of foreclosure risk based in part on the race of their occupants. The administration then insured white homeowners' mortgages if they lived in all white neighborhoods into which there was little danger of African Americans moving. After World War II, the federal government went further and spurred the suburbanization of every metropolitan area by guaranteeing bank loans to mass producing builders who would create all white subdivisions that came to ring American cities. In 1973, the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights concluded that the, quote, housing industry aided and abetted by the government must bear primary responsibility for the legacy of segregated housing. Government and private industry came together to create a system of residential segregation, end quote. I just feel like this. Motherfuckers all day will tell you, oh, why are you depending on a motherfucking government? Why do you expect something from the government? Why don't you just do it on your own? Pull yourself up by the bootstraps. But then we have histories like this that show everything these motherfuckers got was from the government. How dare they gaslight us all and make it seem like we're wrong for asking, demanding, that the very shit that we build actually benefits us. When we see it in very plain day, it says the government was giving motherfuckers like Levitt money to build entire communities without even them breaking ground. You never even built a community before, bro. The government is giving you money to make a whole community. That's crazy to me. That's crazy to me. I don't want to hear nothing. I'm sorry. I'm just talking now. But yeah, these motherfuckers, child.
So with that, y'all would go ahead and end the space, but I encourage y'all if y'all want to have like a discussion space after to end it. Or I'm sorry, to open one. But yeah, tomorrow I'll have chapter 5. I'm gonna see if I can like squeeze a little bit more spaces, maybe one or two space. Or I'm sorry, one or two chapters into one space. But yeah, thank y'all for coming. And like I said, y'all can access and share. It's just an audio book, so you can listen anytime. So y'all take it easy.